Countless raindrops swept in from the Southern Ocean have fashioned this country, clothing its mountains and valleys in unimaginable forests. United and spilling seawards, they soothed the rock faces in their headlong flight to form the rills, runnels, and rivulets of this rain-drenched land. Eventually, inevitably, their beauty gives way to roaring power as they carve through the mountains to form the rivers of western Tasmania. This is the summer flow when the rain is least and the rivers are at their quietest. In winter, when the rain can be literally measured in meters, no one ventures into the western fastness. Until the second half of this century, the forbidding nature of this remote corner of Australia and its impenetrable vegetation had constituted an effective barrier to human entry. Since the coming of the white man, it has confounded a rare official expedition, swallowed the bones of an occasional escaping convict, and allowed a handful of timbermen to fell prized Huon pines for winter floods to wash down the more accessible rivers. To the vast majority of Australians, the very existence of this antique land was unknown. The flowers bloomed unseen. This was to change. In the cities of Tasmania, plans were afoot to make the name of one western river a byword round the nation. The first demonstrators took to the streets of the capital in 1979. The reason? To prevent Tasmania's electricity authority using part of the Franklin River for hydroelectric power. Most had seen the Franklin River only on their television screens. Its visual beauty, thus portrayed, elicited an immediate emotional response from people who only months earlier had not known it existed. But there were a handful of adventurers who knew the western rivers well. They were led by a Tasmanian-born doctor, John Hawkins. Hawkins had seized on the existence of the Franklin in the 1950s. A canoeist, he convinced 3 others that they should join him to become the first men to journey down this remote and dangerous river. Equipped with a movie camera to shoot now obsolete 9.5mm film, the 4 tackled the turbulent Franklin in the summer of 1951. Their canoes were ex-army folding kayaks 17 feet long. They soon proved unsuitable, being virtually unmaneuverable, entering rapids on a river that had not yet dropped to its minimum summer flow. No one knew what troubles lay round the next bend. The canoeists used a leapfrogging technique, one boat tackling each unknown stretch, then waiting for the second to catch up and take over the lead. In few places was it possible to inspect the rapids ahead on foot. The Franklin, more than 120 kilometers long, was now rain-swollen. The inevitable happened, entering a gorge with sheer rock walls 300 meters high. In the canoe which foundered were Hawkins and John Dean. Hawkins, a non-swimmer, had his clothes ripped off by the force of the water, only his life jacket remaining.
If John Hawkins had not had a life jacket on at that stage, I'm sure he wouldn't have survived. Because when I came up out of the water after being thrown from the canoe, I saw him floating downstream on his back, and I then realised that he was unconscious, and I tried to get downstream to him, and in order to do that, I found myself climbing up over a very high peak, and the higher I went, the more formidable I realised the gorge was, and I more or less gave up hope. I thought John had gone, and it was with great relief when I reached the top of this peak and called out that I heard his voice answer from below.
6 years passed before John Dean again found himself preparing to tackle the Franklin with John Hawkins. Hawkins this time was better equipped, but well aware not only of the dangers of the river, but of the virtual impossibility of walking through the impenetrable bush for help if a member of the four-man party suffered an accident. On the still unexplored, still unconquered Franklin, the isolation was complete. And the river could rise a terrifying 10 meters in a single night. Hawkins was not overconfident, and rightly so. Drawing inexhaustible quantities of water from its huge catchment, the river wrecked one canoe. Shortly after, the attempt was abandoned with a determination to try again the following summer. Once again, John Dean was to share the dangers.
In the last attempt down the Franklin, I had the misfortune to have my canoe get jammed full ways across the stream. The stream was quite narrow at that stage, and the canoe tipped just over halfway into the water, and I was unable to get anything other than my head and shoulders above the water because of the force of the current. And it was quite an alarming experience to be held there by the strength of the water and know that the only way out was to go down underneath the canoe, because then I feared that there could be rocks or snags that might jam me, and then that would have been the end. And by the time I came out about 100 yards downstream, I was really quite shaken.
The canoes were fiberglass, in the late 50s, a revolutionary material. John Dean's mishap had badly damaged his canoe, but this time the party of four had 3 canoes, each capable of carrying 2 men. This added insurance proved useful. Dean was to break his canoe in half, patch it, then eventually lose it altogether. Rain once again threatened to flood the river. In the worst stretches, progress was slowed to little more than a kilometre a day to minimize the risks. John Hawkins had by now survived yet another near-fatal mishap in the huge canyon they called Deception Gorge. But gradually, after nearly 5 weeks on the river, they knew that this time they were going to beat the Franklin.
I think once we got past the Cascades, the Newland Cascades, into the lower part of the Franklin and arrived at the Jane River hut, where we spent a day recovering, incidentally, we then knew that we had it beaten. We were then able to relax, I think, for about the first time. Up until then, I think you felt a certain amount of tension from day to day, not knowing whether you were going to get through and, you know, what might happen if you had serious trouble.
The difficulties of the Franklin behind him, John Hawkins turned to other great western rivers. Summer after summer would find his canoe on the Gordon, the Pieman, or increasingly back on the Franklin itself. By now, his obsession to conquer the Franklin had been superseded by his determination to compile a film record of the rivers. David Searle, a dairy farmer, was to become a regular companion. So too was a youngster regarded by his older associates as having the best canoe technique among them, Nigel Houston. Typically, John Hawkins' film ambitions were high. Working virtually single-handed in one of the most difficult areas in the world, he was determined to achieve technical and artistic excellence in portraying man against the rivers. Olegus Trajanus was to champion preservation of the western rivers. The exhilaration they held for him was evident to Hawkins, the filmmaker. For Hawkins himself, the rivers were not a sacred cause, but a private wonderland, a challenge, a source of pure adventure. Problems were of the most basic kind: hunger, exhaustion, staying afloat, staying alive. In recompense, there were mornings of pure enchantment. Days when the canoeists knew they would be one with the river, flowing with it, not fighting it. On the Franklin in particular, such times were cherished. The Hawkins party realized that other eyes were turning to their special river, that its days as an unknown waterway were numbered. Tasmania had already been the scene of a bitter fight over hydroelectric power development, which threatened to flood Lake Pedder, a remote jewel of a lake in the southwest of the island state. Secure behind its shield of mountains and button grass plains, Lake Pedder saw only a handful of summer bushwalkers. Eventually, it also drew visitors from the air to its beach of pure quartzite sand. Amid the emotion-charged debate, Hawkins began filming to clinically reflect the changes that would be wrought if Lake Pedder and its unique beach were flooded. And flooded they were, in Tasmania's single biggest power scheme. In 1980, when the battle lines were drawn over a further power development, this time involving the western rivers, a new conservation movement had emerged, phoenix-like, from the ashes of the Pedder campaign. It put its supporters into the streets in an early attempt to convince government that in the 80s, aesthetics should triumph over economics. This time, the movement had a new leader. A medical practitioner from New South Wales, Bob Brown, had first visited the Franklin River almost reluctantly, persuaded by a friend. Impressed beyond words, he abandoned his profession to become the full-time general of the Conservation Army. Marshalling under the statue of Sir John Franklin, the demonstrators began their task, using the emotional pull of a hitherto unknown river to check the Tasmanian pattern of industrialization based on hydroelectric power. For the young, the message had special appeal. The community began to divide. For John Hawkins, the cameraman, there had been no such mental struggles. Through the 1970s, working in a few available weeks each summer, he pursued his personal goal of capturing on film the essential, challenging qualities of his special rivers. For Hawkins, the perfectionist, achieving that goal meant chancing fickle weather, dangerous terrain, and the continued cooperation of his fellow canoeists. John Hawkins' passion had become remarkable, even to the close-knit band who would sit with him round the evening campfires, reliving the day's events. It was the more remarkable for the fact that the Tasmanian-born Hawkins now lived thousands of miles away in what many would regard as the real Australia. The red centre, the great desert heart of continental Australia, was now permanent home to the riverman. Alice Springs, a small oasis in the desert with all mod cons, surviving on artesian water trapped deep underground. The antithesis of the Tasmanian river country. In Alice Springs, the bed of the Todd River, bone dry for most of the year, is the favoured campsite of desert aborigines. Alice Springs was to put extraordinary pressures on John Hawkins, but provide him with extraordinary fulfillment. Based at the local hospital, he was the only surgeon serving both black and white communities in an area bigger than the British Isles. As a result of his surgical work, his name became a household word throughout the outback. John Hawkins' ability to cater for the surgical emergencies occurring over such an immense area was helped in large part by good radio links with outback communities and stations and the existence of an extremely efficient aerial medical service. Not that these twin mainstays of outback medicine eased the workload of a solo surgeon. Instead, they increased it by virtually guaranteeing the outback community the services of a competent surgeon around the clock. As a general surgeon, John Hawkins performed successfully and cheerfully complicated surgery which in urban Australia would have been tackled only by specialist teams. Off the job, the surgeon's medical colleagues had become an expectant audience for his latest footage from the Franklin. On the job, concentration was total. First notice of major surgical problems from the vast outback reached the Alice Springs Hospital through a radio network controlled by the Royal Flying Doctor Service. For more routine matters, there are set radio schedules every day of the week.
This is BJD standing by for any medical consultations. I have 8 Tango India Mobile. Are there any others? Tango India Mobile. Good morning, sister. Go ahead.
Dr. Kerry Kirk, now Director of Health in Central Australia, worked alongside John Hawkins as the anaesthetist.
The patients came in for John Hawkins' attention in the Alice Springs Hospital by air ambulance, day and night, 7 days a week. They might have spear wounds, or they might be a woman with a complicated childbirth, might be a stockman with broken limbs from an accident on cattle mustering camp, or maybe somebody who'd been involved in a car accident up to 500 miles away from town.
The patient fell off a horse at the stock camp yesterday, and this morning his left leg below the knee is very swollen and painful. He's unable to wait there, and there is some obvious deformity. His observations are satisfactory: temperature 36.8, pulse 80, respiration 22, blood pressure 120 over 80. Over.
Tango India Mobile, all okay. I've got all that, thanks, sister. He certainly needs to come to hospital, at least for an X-ray to confirm that diagnosis.
Air turbulence above the searing heat of the desert can turn a simple medical pickup into an endurance test. The longest return trips can take 4 to 5 hours flying time. Pleasant enough in the cool of early morning, but exhausting in the full heat of the day. This hard country demands knowledgeable pilots, dependable twin-engine aircraft, and the experienced nursing sisters who constitute the regular flying arm of the aerial medical service. Before the advent of the service, many lonely graves were dug in the outback for people who a surgeon's skills would have saved. Today, despite a lack of navigational aids in some remote areas, the service is there when required to pick up a stockman whose horse has rolled on him, or an outback tourist who has suffered some similar fate. As an all-round medical service, the area operation based on Alice Springs provides a degree of security for the people of the outback that urban hospitals could not better. Its highly enviable reputation is based squarely on performance and the unstinting efforts of people like John Hawkins, efforts beyond mere surgical ability.
John Hawkins was the only surgeon for an area of about 500,000 square miles. The nearest specialised help was in Adelaide to the south, 1,000 miles away, and in Darwin to the north, another 1,000 miles away. And John was called in for every emergency, every surgical illness. Sometimes this went on day and night for months on end. And he was very adept, a very good surgeon, and I've never seen anybody who could cope with the variety of problems that he had to, like he could. I know personally hundreds of people, both in Alice Springs itself and in the remotest parts of Central Australia, who remember him with great affection, and they don't remember him with this sort of affection just because of the surgery he performed. He no doubt saved their arms or their legs or their lives, but they remember him, I think, perhaps even more so because he was the sort of person he was.
George Brown, now an independent radio expert, was in charge of the Royal Flying Doctor Communications Base in Alice Springs when John Hawkins took up his post.
He would have been on call for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and such responsibility didn't weigh unduly heavily on him. He didn't get him down. He responded to people. He was a man who unfailingly of good humor. He was very kindly disposed towards his fellow man, and nothing was too much trouble to John. So much so that he was in demand, constant demand, by every person in the area. When I say area, I'm talking about an area the size of Great Britain. And the tendency in the Northern Territory is that if you know someone and you know them well, or you know they do good work, then you're constantly calling upon that person. And for this reason, John would be getting called out at all hours of the day and night, and he could never really sit down and say he had a day off while he was on duty, while he was here in the centre. His only holidays would be when he left the area.
Leaving the area, inevitably, meant returning to the Tasmanian rivers. If the detailed planning required for the river expeditions had been more difficult from Alice Springs, that only made the anticipation the greater. John Hawkins knew the rivers would once again have something new to offer. It was approaching 30 years since his pioneering foray on the King River in 1949. This time, with David Searle, it was to be a return to the Franklin, where they were to be joined by Hawkins' friend, Nigel Houston. The first glimpse after 12 months. The river looked promising. The weather, if it held, would be ideal for filming, and the first campsite offered a gentle reawakening to the perimeter of the western river country. A clear, clean runoff indicated a low water level and a relaxing start to the trip ahead. Time to drink in the surroundings and prepare mind and muscles for the rapids ahead. Most rapids were unnamed, but the Hawkins party knew the more spectacular ones by heart and put names to them. The Cauldron, the Pig Trough, the Widowmaker. Nigel Houston, according to his companions, had the ability to make it look easier than it was. But each had his personal moment of extreme danger. Canoe and canoeist more or less intact, though it wasn't always that simple. As David Searle recalls, a simple mishap could result in a ruined trip and extreme hardship.
When we finally got on the Franklin in 1978, with one of John's old canoeing compatriots and his two sons, we started off fine, but within an hour of setting off from Collingwood Bridge, we, lining the canoe down a large rapid, snagged it up on a log and wrecked the whole thing, lost half our gear, $2,000 worth of camera equipment. Then faced with a situation as to whether we try to walk overland to the road or to go up the river. And after reconnoitring over the country and spending several hours trying to force a way through the bush and horizontal, we gave that away and then set about walking up the river, which took us 2 days to force our way through. It's some of the most arduous exertion I'd ever want to encounter.
If the hardships were great, so too were the compensations for those who returned time and time again to see the rivers in all their moods. Conservation leader Bob Brown had by now experienced the Franklin. In preparation for the battle he intended to wage, he began selecting evocative names for river features and sought their official acceptance. The rough and ready unofficial names were replaced. The Hawkins party now traveled through Serenity Sound, Transcendence Reach, the Sanctum, and the Great Gorge Irenicus, from the Greek words bottomless and peace.
The first things when I think about those trips is the companionship with the four of us. It's a strange thing when you think about the sort of excitement of the actual canoeing. It quite often comes second in reminiscences. The first being the camps on the rivers and the sort of solitude and the winding down after that excitement and getting together and discussing the different happenings of the day. And generally, any day there would be some pretty exciting things happening, rescues and the like. And within that environment, at all times, the thing on a river was that presence of the water, of the power of the water. The campsite is not like it is in a lot of bush camps where it can be very quiet, assuming you're not in a gale on a mountain, there's a roar, and it's with you the whole trip. If the trip takes a week, that roar is with you. It never leaves you. And this brings something out in the... It's a different sort of solitude. And four of us would be very closely bound within the sort of power of that noise, because it would be a noise. I wouldn't think I'd ever consider, or would have ever considered, that we were the only four in the world. But at times in those situations, I feel that perhaps we're the only four that are really coming to terms with what matters. In other words, we've left a horrible sort of humdrum racing existence, and we're an existence where we're all trying to build ourselves up all the time. And what happens in a situation like that, again, with the power of that water and the bush and the need to survive with it, not fight it, but survive with it, you come down to size, and you become quite humbled.
But in the state parliament, it was with pride that Doug Lowe, Tasmania's most popular premier in history, announced his government's energy decision. Tasmania would have the less economic power scheme. The Franklin would not be touched. The river, whose existence had first come to the attention of most members of the government less than 3 years before, was to become the shining crown of a new national park. For the first time, the advice of the government's hydroelectric commissioner on a major new power proposal had been set aside. Advice had been accepted from other quarters, following an effective public campaign based on the pictorial beauty of the Franklin. Knowing that not one Tasmanian in 1,000 had experienced the river firsthand, Bob Brown and his colleagues had relied on the power of film and television to convey the image of the Franklin as they perceived it. Their success had been spectacular. The battle had been won. The conservation ethic was now firmly planted in the hearts of a majority of government members that the Franklin would not be changed. But a single battle is not a war, and the Franklin had been changed already. The racket of helicopters now echoed regularly in the river valleys. Government politicians were treated to their first views of the river in aerial comfort. Naturalists and journalists of varying repute were whisked in dry-footed. Eyewitness accounts were prepared like so much instant coffee. The Franklin was no longer Hawkins River. Visitors trickled in to float downstream on rubber rafts, some in response to a barrage of national publicity extolling the beauty, but not the danger of the river. Helicopter rescues began. The Franklin claimed its first lives. Inexorably, pressure mounted for the government to reverse its decision and build the power scheme which would flood the lower third of the Franklin. The pressure came principally from industries, many of which had been attracted to Tasmania by the potential for cheap power, and from unions, fearful of the effects of the government's decision on future employment. The independent upper house of the Tasmanian Parliament had refused to accept the government's compromise power scheme. For 12 months, the Parliament remained deadlocked. The Tasmanian community divided on the issue. The government itself became divided. Despite the increasingly grim headlines, the Premier remained resolute, even in the face of pressure from the unions which made up the backbone of the governing Labour Party. But when a group of Power Authority unionists marched on Parliament House to tell their Premier what they thought of his decision, the nightmare began for the man who for so long had basked in the approval of the Labour movement.
The workers of the Hydroelectric Commission advise you of their total lack of confidence in you as the Minister responsible for the Hydroelectric Commission to safeguard their job security for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, they call upon you to resign your position as Premier of Tasmania.
Only 2 years previously, Doug Lowe had led his government to a resounding election victory, polling in the process the biggest personal vote in Tasmanian history.
You have allowed the reputation of the Commission and its workers to be brought into disrepute.
If we thought that we were going to create unemployment by our decision, we would not have decided on it. And we are not going to stand, we're not going to stand for the tyranny of an upper house that is wanting to change the fundamental rules of the Parliament.
The Premier's attempt to pin the blame on the upper house was wearing thin with both the unions and disenchanted members of the governing party.
How much regard should we give to natural heritage? How much regard should we give to the economic factors involved? We haven't been brainwashed.
In December 1981, with the Parliament still deadlocked, the people of Tasmania voted at a compulsory referendum. A majority decreed that the dam be built, that the lower third of the Franklin be flooded. But the Wilderness Society refused to accept the majority decision and widened its campaign. From Britain, it enticed television naturalist David Bellamy, a performer not noted for subtlety.
Now, I just had to do that. Take a drink from a real wild river, the last one left here in Tasmania. And by wild, I mean that nowhere above stream or below stream has it been affected by man.
David, I assume that you very often go to places, people take you in and then tell you that they're about to be destroyed.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, this is one of the problems of my job. I'm a conservationist with a loud mouth, so I get dragged around to see these things. But I must say, on the optimistic side, I'm being dragged to more places recently where you're seeing positive things happening, because there is a reaction in society. There's a grassroots movement of conservation going on, and people are standing up and saying places like this must be conserved. So, yeah, I'm taking the bad uns, and I'm being taken to a few more good uns, and I hope this is going to be a good one in the future.
1981 also saw the discovery of a massive cave on the forbidding banks of the Franklin. A cave inhabited by Tasmanian Aborigines at the time of the last Ice Age and rich in artifacts. Prehistorian Rhys Jones.
I think it's one of the most significant archaeological finds that ever been made in Australia. In terms of richness, I know of no cave site in the whole of Australia which is as rich. It's as rich, I mean, when I was a boy, I used to excavate once in the caves of France. And it's as rich as the richest of the great classic caves of France.
According to Rhys Jones, when this cave was inhabited, the Franklin flowed through a treeless tundra, and icebergs growled along the Tasmanian coast.
What we think in terms of the Ice Age chronology, the time, This is after the Ice Age, probably, say 10 to 6,000 years. This is probably 15 to 18,000 years. And we guess that these cobbles and these pebbles and stuff may date to before the last Ice Age, or the last part of the last Ice Age, round about, say, 20 to 24,000 years ago. And of course, that rests directly on bedrock. Now, what we're trying to do is we're getting charcoal samples from here, from these clays, from this stuff here, and from this top stuff, and we will actually be able to get carbon dates to test whether our theory is in fact right.
Amid the scientific excitement, Tasmanians threw out their Labour government and installed a pro-dam regime under Liberal leader Robin Gray.
They fought a battle here in Tasmania, and Tasmanians gave us a clear mandate at the last election to build that dam. We've had referendum and debate over this whole issue that's gone on for 2 years, that's destroyed confidence amongst the business community, that's cost thousands of jobs in Tasmania, and I'm not going to tolerate any more of that nonsense as far as Tasmania is concerned.
With no roads, the rivers became highways for the transport of the machines which were to begin the dam work. Police accompanied every convoy, aware that opponents of the dam from all parts of Australia had massed along the waterways, waiting to disrupt any attempt at construction. For some of the protesters, the exercise was an expenses-paid adventure subsidized by organizations determined to stop construction. Many were students, others were unemployed activists. All were schooled to maximize the attention of the cameras in what was to become a media circus. Floating accommodation had been provided for the big numbers of police called in by the state government. The Wilderness Society plan was to stage manage a steady stream of arrests for the cameras, to disrupt work as much as possible, and at all costs, to sustain the interest of the national news organizations. More dangerous were the attempts to stop the bulldozers being ferried upriver to the worksite. While the construction helicopters hovered above, protesters hidden in the rain-sodden bush along the river were waiting to make their prearranged gesture of defiance, but only when the news crews were in position to film the action. Ceremonial possession of a bulldozer today might make a front-page picture around the nation tomorrow. With incidents such as this, the number of arrests soon ran into the hundreds, and a major logistics problem developed in transferring those arrested, first by river, then road, to the capital, Hobart, and prison. And when this type of protest became too repetitive for the jaded journalists, big-name volunteers offered themselves up before the cameras, talking all the way.
This area beyond these gates that has been untouched by man to date. When you go through there, you step back 40 million years into a landscape as much of Australia was round about that time.
Well, when you step through there, you're going to step into the hands of the police, aren't you?
Well, I'm going to step into the problems of the 20th century, and that's what we're here talking about.
And yet another word on behalf of the sponsor before leaving for a brief spell behind bars.
I think 600 people have been arrested, and we've been arrested against laws of pure convenience, set up to stop all the people protesting against violation and crime against humanity. We are the we aren't the criminals. The police are only doing their job. It's the developers who are the criminals, and they have flouted an international law. This is international land. This is a national park, and there is no reason why we shouldn't be here.
Outside Tasmania, the protest was having its desired effect. Most mainland Australians who felt strongly about the issue espoused the emotion-charged cause of the Wilderness Society. In the national election year, this did not go unnoticed by a federal Labour Party which had spent 27 of the past 30 years in opposition. Elect us, said the Labour leader Bob Hawke, and we'll stop the dam.
A Labor government will use all the powers at our disposal to ensure that the dam is not proceeded with.
In London, British comedian Spike Milligan joined the growing band, prepared to tell the Tasmanian government it must stop construction.
Throw away your heritage for 3,000 unemployed. I know it's very Christian, but in the long run, very unprofitable, and that you're going to lose money.
In Australia, Bob Hawke's anti-dam promises were a big hit at rallies organised outside Tasmania by the Wilderness Society. The earrings of Hawke's wife Hazel said all. The Hawke-led Labour Party was to win the 1983 election convincingly, even though it could not take a single seat in Tasmania.
Labour comes into government after the 5th of March, the dam will not proceed.
And as Prime Minister, Hawke was to make good his promise by asking the High Court of Australia to rule the dam works illegal because the Australian government had signed an international agreement placing the river's country on the World Heritage List. The 7 judges of the High Court, in Tasmania's view, were being asked to decide whether or not the state had power to manage affairs within its own boundaries. But while participants and the media waited, the judges deliberated not about state authority, nor about the pros and cons of a dam, but solely about the national government's rights and powers under international treaties it had signed.
The Franklin River controversy is over. In Brisbane this morning, the High Court of Australia ruled in favour of the Commonwealth that the dam should not be built. It was a majority decision with the narrowest possible of margins, 4 judges to 3. The Chief Justice, Sir Harry Gibb, was among the 3 who dissented. The High Court made it clear that its ruling was based on Australia's legal right to make treaties with external powers and had nothing to do with the merits or otherwise of building a dam in Tasmania. Tasmanian Premier Robin Gray has already indicated...
So work on the dam stopped. The Franklin will flow unchecked, unless or until a national government of a different persuasion reverses the Hawke government's decision.
Dear Mrs. Hawkins, the Tasmanian government has accepted the name Hawkins Blaze for a large quartzite slab on the wall of the Great Ravine on the Franklin River. I'm informed John Hawkins made special mention of this feature, which he first recorded during his pioneering voyages on the Franklin. It is therefore particularly pleasing to inform you that his name will be officially and permanently connected with the river in this way. Yours sincerely.
Whatever the future, the past remains inviolate. For John Hawkins alone, the adventure never ended. The river's pioneer died of a heart attack during a film expedition in 1979. Damned or undamned, Hawkins Blaze stands high above the Franklin. Hawkins' name will be part of the Western rivers forever.